You find yourself drifting through the soot-laced mist of a London evening, sometime in the heart of the 1850s. The lamps have just been lit. A quiet house on a quiet street exudes the faintest glow through heavy drapery, its windows tight-latched against the chill. Inside, in a drawing room padded with silence, a young woman sits beneath the stiff weight of expectation. Her gloves are ivory. Her spine is straight. Her hands rest lightly in her lap, and her eyes gaze forward without meeting anything in particular. She is not waiting for a man, not for love, but for permission, for the proper conditions under which she may be allowed, someday, to feel something. In the Victorian world, love did not arrive unannounced. It came only after certain rituals had been fulfilled, social obligations, silent agreements, and unspoken rules etched into every minute of a respectable woman's life. A woman, especially a young one of good breeding, was never permitted to be alone with a gentleman. She was not to roam freely, nor speak boldly. All interactions were to be supervised, chaperoned, and sanitized of even the whiff of impropriety. Even the word flirt was heavy with danger, and a single misstep, a smile held too long, a comment made too freely, could invite ruin. Courtship, then, began not in a moment of connection but in a maze of regulation. The first encounter might happen in a parlor where conversation was stitched with caution and conducted beneath the watchful gaze of a stern aunt or a tight-lipped governess. The gentleman would arrive not in passion, but in ceremony. He would hand over a calling card, crisp, engraved, a token of intent, to the family servant, who would deliver it upstairs like a missive from some foreign land. If he were approved, and only then, he would be permitted to speak with the young lady. For 10 minutes, perhaps 15, about the weather, the Sunday sermon, the local flower show, nothing more. And so it would begin, not with a kiss, not even with a touch, but with a nod, a gesture, a line of speech so rehearsed and cautious it barely resembled desire. Courtship was a performance, and the parlor was the stage. Even the very way a lady sat, her posture, her choice of reading material, the manner in which she rang the bell for tea, was part of the unspoken evaluation. One did not court the heart. One courted the household, the lineage, the invisible values stitched into the fabric of a surname. Presentation mattered. A wrinkle in the glove could suggest carelessness. A scuffed boot could hint at lower breeding. Everything was a sign. Everything a signal. The wrong scent, the wrong shade of ribbon, the wrong tone of voice could disqualify someone before love had a chance to sprout. And still, within this tightly corseted world, affection tried to survive. Sometimes in stolen glances. Sometimes in carefully crafted compliments. Sometimes in silence. A young lady might return a calling card with a faint floral imprint, or a pressed flower, or, if her heart was especially bold, a handkerchief embroidered with her initials. But nothing more. She was to be watchful, modest, passive. Interest was unladylike. Attraction was a thing to be hidden. Desire, that most human of impulses, was the enemy of respectability. Men had more room to maneuver, but even they were shackled by the same expectations. A gentleman might harbor feelings for a woman of lower class, but he could never act on them without risking the collapse of his family's social position. Likewise, a woman from a well-off family might receive overtures from someone beneath her station, but she would be reminded, daily and forcefully, that romance without security was not love, but foolishness. And yet they did fall in love, somehow. Amid all this artifice, all this etiquette, all this deliberate stillness, the human heart found cracks in the plaster. Two people might begin to know each other, if not through speech, then through rhythm. The rhythm of visits, the repetition of presence, the familiarity of seeing one another always surrounded by the same curtains, the same tea trays, the same ticking of the grandfather clock. And within that repetition, something genuine might take root. Still, it was a dangerous thing to feel too deeply. Reputation in Victorian society was not simply a matter of pride. It was currency. A woman's worth could be measured in whispers, the things said behind fans at garden parties, the rumors exchanged during the intermission at a recital. If she was thought too bold, too forward, too knowing, her value diminished in the eyes of marriageable men. She became a cautionary tale. And so, mothers taught daughters not to smile too widely, not to speak unless spoken to, not to laugh too freely. Girls were trained in restraint the way musicians are trained in scales. They became fluent in stillness. And so the waiting continued. For permission. For a second visit. For a formal declaration. For the fortune to be verified. For the season to pass. For the feeling to become acceptable. Victorian dating was not a matter of two souls colliding, but of two estates negotiating. Love was a possibility, always hovering, always distant, but it had to wait its turn behind duty, class, and social preservation. If you listen closely, you might still hear the sound of it. A quiet sigh in a candlelit drawing room, the rustle of gloves against linen, the deliberate ticking of time. Not passion, not ecstasy, but a measured, aching hope that maybe, someday, it would be permitted to feel. If words were forbidden, gestures would have to suffice. In the heavily monitored parlors and manicured gardens of Victorian society, where every glance was measured and every moment supervised, lovers developed a language all their own, a delicate, silent code woven through the flutter of a fan, the tilt of a head, the drop of a glove. In a world where speaking too freely could cost a woman her future and a man his status, they resorted to symbols. It was the only way to say what could not be said. A woman, seated demurely on a settee with her fan in hand, might appear to be fending off the heat or brushing away a strand of hair. But those who knew, those who had been taught, could read the signals. Opening the fan slowly and looking over it, "I admire you." Placing it closed on her left cheek, tapping it on her right shoulder, "Come speak to me." And if she let it slip, just slightly, from her gloved hand onto the floor, that gesture might carry more weight than a dozen formal proposals. Fans were more than accessories. They were the sanctioned flirtation devices of the age. Acceptable in polite society and almost invisible to those not paying attention, they were the perfect tools for covert communication. Mothers often taught their daughters these codes not out of rebellion, but because they understood the quiet desperation that came from having feelings with nowhere to go. It wasn't just fans. Gloves, too, spoke volumes. To remove one's glove in public was no small matter. Skin was sacred. Victorian culture regarded the bare hand as something personal, not to be revealed carelessly. And so, if a lady allowed her glove to slip while accepting a calling card, or while reaching for a teacup beside a suitor's, the meaning was unmistakable. A message passed without a single syllable. Men knew the codes as well. Not all of them, but the observant ones, the ones who watched more than they spoke, could read the signs. A glance held a moment too long. The way a young lady stood slightly apart from her chaperone. The sudden stillness when he entered the room. Even the absence of a reaction could be telling. In a world where every young woman was trained to be polite, choosing not to be could be its own kind of declaration. There were rules, of course, endless rules, But those rules bred resistance in the form of cleverness. A dropped handkerchief, a scarf loosely tied, a carefully selected flower pinned to a gown. Lilies meant purity. Red roses were too bold for public wear, but a single one pressed into a book and handed to a gentleman, that was not decoration. That was a confession. In certain houses, especially during formal visits, a tray of biscuits or sweets might be offered to guests. If a lady selected one and offered it directly to a gentleman, bypassing the silver tongs, it was considered scandalously intimate. No one would dare say so aloud, of course, but reputations could be stirred by far less. And then there were the eyes. If nothing else could be trusted, not even coded fans or carefully choreographed gloves, the eyes remained the oldest and most truthful channel. In a room where conversation was stilted and opinions dangerous, a glance could shout. At dinner parties, young women would often study their plates or the corner of a painting. But once in a while, their gaze would rise, not by accident, and meet the eyes of someone across the room. Just for a second. Just long enough. These moments were fleeting, and yet entire relationships were built on them. There were couples who had exchanged no more than 10 words before becoming engaged. But the language they had spoken, the unspoken, the invisible, the deeply practiced choreography of expression, had spoken louder than any letter. To love someone, in the Victorian sense, was to risk greatly while revealing little. To be known through suggestion, to be desired through ritual. Everything public had to remain proper, but everything underneath was quietly alive. Trembling. Waiting. There was a thrill in this silence. In not knowing exactly what the other meant, but believing you did. In not touching but still feeling heat. In not saying, "I want you," but somehow hearing it anyway. In the turn of a fan, the absence of a glove, the way a woman looked up from her sewing and didn't look away quite fast enough. This was romance before words. Before clarity. It was frustrating. Exquisite. It required endless patience. But perhaps that was the point, that by the time you reached one another, you had earned it. In a world where love was barely permitted, its expression became art. And so they continued, two young people seated at opposite ends of a room, a chaperone between them, silence pressing down like velvet. And yet, within that silence, something stirred, something that no rulebook could quite extinguish. He would lean forward slightly. She would raise her fan. They understood each other perfectly. The paper was thick, slightly off-white, with a soft grain pressed into it like the memory of an old curtain. The ink was dark but not harsh, drawn slowly from a reservoir pen or, more likely, a dip pen carefully sharpened with a penknife. The handwriting curled like ivy, delicate, considered, sometimes hesitant. And when the letter finally arrived, folded 3 times, sealed with wax or a pressed edge, bearing the scent of lavender or lemon polish, it did not land in a woman's hand with the lightness of mail. It settled like a heartbeat. In Victorian England, to write a letter was to declare something, and to receive one was to agree, silently, to read between the lines. Courtship, after all, was not forged in declarations of passion, not aloud, not openly. It was built instead through restraint, through metaphor, through the exquisite patience of two people trying to find one another across oceans of etiquette. When a man sat to write his first letter to a woman, he did not begin with endearments. There were no dears, no my beloveds, unless some formal arrangement had already been made. The first letter was often painfully formal. He might address her as Miss, followed by her surname, and then proceed with a kind of ritualistic stiffness. "I hope this note finds you in continued good health," or "Permit me to extend my thanks for your family's hospitality on Thursday last." And yet, even in that rigidity, the courtship had begun. For what followed, a single line, a second paragraph, a closing signature, was more revealing than any spoken conversation ever could be. The tone might shift, imperceptibly, from courteous to fond. He might reference a shared moment. "I found myself thinking again of the waltz you spoke of, and the elegance with which you described it." Or he might praise her intellect. "Your remark on Milton's Paradise Lost was one of great insight, and I confess I have revisited the passage since." None of these phrases said, "I like you," but every one of them meant it. The letter might take 3 days to reach her, longer, if the weather turned. It would be handed to her by a servant or delivered in a small stack of correspondence. She would excuse herself to her room, draw the curtain, sit at her writing desk, and there, in silence, she would unfold his words like petals. She would read them twice, sometimes 3 times, and when she wrote back, the act became a kind of ceremony. The selection of paper mattered. Some used heavy ivory stock, embossed with initials. Others preferred pale blue, a color associated with modesty and sincerity. The pen had to be refilled every few lines, and the ink would smudge if the letter was folded too soon. Each sentence was composed, then reconsidered. She might write a full page, then burn it. Start again. Shorten it. Soften it. And what did she say? Very little. At least, not directly. She might thank him for his kind note, and then mention a book she was reading. She might include a detail from her daily life, the lilacs blooming near her window, her younger sister's piano recital, the way the sunlight had fallen across the garden that morning. These were not romantic statements, but to the man who received them, to the one who read slowly, hungrily, carefully, they were sacred. For even the choice of flower she mentioned could carry meaning. The lilac? First love. The gardenia? Secret admiration. A reference to rain might suggest longing. A passing note on an aching head or sleeplessness might whisper, "I have been thinking of something or someone that unsettles me." And always the tone had to be just right. Too distant, and the suitor might lose heart. Too forward, and the woman might risk her name. She was walking, always, on a narrow bridge suspended over scandal. One misplaced word, one poorly timed flourish, could summon a wave of gossip that would undo everything. And yet they persisted, because within this slow, painstaking ritual was something more intoxicating than any physical closeness. In their letters, they were unchaperoned, alone, free. These pages, folded and sealed, passed between them like secret rooms, places where words could hover longer than breath, and where emotion could be carved slowly, with care. Some men grew bolder. Over time, their letters lengthened. Sentences softened. He might include a poem. Not his own, of course, that would be too revealing, but something from Tennyson or Byron. So word by word and line by line, "The dead man touched me from the past." She would know what it meant, and he would wait for a reply. And some women learned to dance in ink. They became artists of the unsaid. A woman might write, "I find these autumn evenings a touch lonelier than expected," and then continue to speak of her aunt's embroidery. But the man would hear it. Lonelier. He would hear it in his chest. Letters became a kind of invisible hand, reaching, tracing, longing. There were lovers who exchanged dozens before ever touching fingertips. And not all letters were successful. Some men, unsure of tone or timing, overreached. A poorly chosen sentence, one too familiar or too possessive, could end everything. A woman might show the letter to her mother, who would scowl. The note would be returned unread, or worse, unanswered. That was the risk. In Victorian courtship, the pen was more dangerous than the kiss, because the pen preserved everything. Each note was a mirror, a test, a performance. But also, if one was brave and careful and true, a bridge. Many love stories never made it beyond the letter. Others lived entirely within them. Some were buried with their authors, tied in faded ribbons, tucked in drawers never opened again. But some, against all odds, found life. Two people, writing from opposite ends of expectation and society, managed to see one another clearly through paper, to reach through the silence. And when they finally met again, in the parlor or the drawing room or the garden after service, it was not as strangers. Not anymore. They had already said everything. In letters, in quiet, and in love. The card was no larger than a palm, and yet it carried the weight of 100 expectations. Rectangular, cream-colored, pressed with a slight border and engraved in black script, Mr. John L. Hargrave. Or perhaps Mr. Thomas Bexley, ESQ, or simply Lieutenant Henry T. Wren. The name was always presented plainly, with dignity, never adorned with flourishes. Too much decoration was considered vulgar. Too little, and it suggested a lack of refinement. The calling card was not merely a formality, it was the key to the door, the silent signal of intent. It spoke before the man did, and it often decided whether he would be allowed to speak at all. When a gentleman first called upon a lady, or more precisely upon her family, he did not knock at the door and demand entrance. That would be intrusive, too forward. He left his card, sometimes in person, sometimes through a servant, sometimes alongside a bouquet if he wished to be bold. The card was placed on a silver salver by the butler and carried into the drawing room. And then the family would decide, not if he was liked, but if he was admissible. If he passed that invisible threshold of acceptability, of rank, manner, propriety, he would be invited to return at a later date, at a fixed hour, for what was known as a formal visit. It would take place, inevitably, in the parlor, the front room of the house. Neither intimate nor entirely public. Neutral ground, lined with proper chairs and perhaps a decorative piano no one dared touch. If the visit was scheduled for 4 o'clock, he must arrive precisely at 4. Not before, not after. Timeliness was not just polite, it was character. Upon arrival, he would be greeted, never by the young lady herself, but by her mother, her aunt, or her governess. These guardians of reputation would usher him into the parlor and summon the young lady only after he had been seated and sufficiently evaluated from across the lace-draped threshold. And then she would enter, not hurriedly, not breathlessly, calm, poised, deliberate. She would offer her hand, gloved always, and he would bow over it without touching. The two would sit, not beside one another but across, with a low table between. Sometimes tea would be brought, sometimes just water. The formality was almost suffocating. Their conversation was shaped like a fence, built line by line to keep emotion at bay. They spoke of books, not the ones with passion, but the ones approved by family libraries. They spoke of music, never of dancing unless it was in the context of church functions. They spoke of weather, of the Queen, of neighbors, of dogs. But never of desire, never of longing. Even praise had to be carefully measured. "Your garden is well tended," he might say. "The roses have such color." And she might nod just once. "We've been fortunate with the sun this week." To an outsider, the conversation would seem dull empty, even lifeless. But to the two participants, it could be a storm of suppressed emotion. Every word was weighed. Every glance carried risk. For the entire time, they were being watched. The chaperone did not hover, that would be rude, but she was always present. Sitting in the same room, just far enough away to pretend not to listen, just close enough to intervene if needed. Her role was silent but absolute. She was the protector not just of the girl's honor, but of the family's future. A stain upon a daughter could shadow a younger sister. A scandal, even whispered, could sink 3 generations. Sometimes the chaperone was a mother, concerned and cautious. Other times, a hired companion, trained in vigilance. There were even stories of young women sabotaged by their own relatives, chaperones who discouraged matches deemed unsuitable, not out of concern, but out of calculation. A younger sister, perhaps more beautiful. A cousin with ambitions. The parlor was a place of conversation, yes, but also quiet warfare. And yet, against this stiff backdrop, real connection sometimes bloomed. The couple might meet in the parlor once a week, then twice. If the gentleman was punctual, if he was courteous, if he remembered details, the name of her dog, the hymn she preferred, the book she mentioned in passing, he might be granted further visits. The chaperone would soften. The silence would thin. He might then be invited to stay for supper. Still not alone. Still under watch. But now part of the family table. This was a critical step, for it meant he was no longer merely calling. He was being considered. Even then, the interaction remained public. They might play a game of cards. He might watch her embroider. Occasionally, in more liberal households, the gentleman might offer to read aloud. A page from Dickens, perhaps. Or the morning paper. If she was allowed to laugh at something he said, it was victory. If she blushed, and the mother didn't scold, it was encouragement. If she looked at him, really looked, and didn't look away, it was everything. Sometimes there were other suitors. Another man might arrive 2 days later and leave his card. And so, the girl found herself in a quiet contest she could not openly acknowledge. She must not appear too eager with either gentleman. She must not favor. And yet she must signal, somehow, which one she preferred. A longer conversation. A slightly warmer smile. The offering of a particular chair. Men noticed these things. Or thought they did. A young man might spend the entire ride home dissecting a half-smile, wondering if her hesitation meant disinterest or nerves. He would reread her expression like a poem. He might stay up all night drafting a note of thanks, 3 paragraphs long, just to express how pleased he was by the warmth and elegance of your family's company. But if a man were denied, if his card went unanswered, if no invitation arrived, if a visit was declined with vague apologies, he could not complain. He could not plead. The family had spoken, and their silence was final. Sometimes, men persisted. They left cards again. They asked mutual acquaintances to intercede. Some even begged, writing letters that blurred the line between formality and foolishness. These were rarely successful. A gentleman knew when to step back, or at least he was expected to. And sometimes, chaperones made mistakes. They left the room a moment too long, or dozed in the sun-drenched parlor, or were distracted by tea preparations. And in those stolen moments, the couple might speak more freely, ask questions with real weight, let their eyes rest a little longer. Sometimes, a hand might brush another, gloved, barely there, and leave the air humming for hours afterward. But always the game reset. The chaperone returned. The masks resumed. In time, if affection continued, and if propriety held, the visits might evolve into courtship. And courtship, in the Victorian sense, was nearly engagement. Public, monitored, moving slowly toward the real business of life, marriage. But in that early stage, when all they had were cards and parlor hours, guarded words and interrupted moments, what they shared was tension, longing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't certain. But it was real. And sometimes, when they looked back years later, after marriage, after children, after the parlor had become memory, it was those first visits they remembered most. When nothing could be said, and yet everything was felt. It did not happen with a kiss. It almost never did. In the Victorian world, the moment a couple passed from the realm of courtship into engagement was not marked by a breathless confession or a tumble into each other's arms. There were no hurried elopements, no stolen nights under stars. There was, instead, a conversation, structured, delicate, and often filtered through third parties. And following that, a silence. Then a letter. Then an invitation. And then, finally, a formal announcement. Engagement was not simply a romantic commitment. It was a social contract, forged as much in drawing rooms as in hearts. It required approval. It demanded negotiation. It followed ritual, ancient, rigid, relentless in its precision. For a man, the first step was not to propose to the woman, but to her father. He would call, again formally, at the family home and request a private meeting with the patriarch. Sometimes this was arranged in advance. Other times it was expected. In either case, he would arrive with no assumptions. No presumption. Just a request. He might be offered sherry. He might be kept waiting. When the two men sat together, the suitor was expected to speak clearly but humbly. He would express admiration for the young lady, not love, never yet love, and request permission to make his intentions known. The father, in turn, would not answer immediately. He might inquire about income, about future prospects, about family background. He might already know everything, of course, but it was necessary to ask. This was not conversation, it was examination. If the gentleman passed this test, he would be told he had the father's blessing to proceed. Not to marry, not yet, but to propose. That alone was a gift. And so, the man would return to the house, not with flowers or a ring, but with readiness. Sometimes the proposal took place in the parlor. Sometimes in the garden. Sometimes during a chaperoned walk. Just far enough from others to allow privacy, but never entirely alone. The man would speak gently, carefully. He would offer not passion but commitment, not longing but certainty. I would be honored, he might say, if you would consider sharing your life with me. And the woman, who almost always already knew what was coming, would not cry or gasp. She would listen. She would lower her eyes. She would pause. And then she would answer with quiet formality. Yes, she might say. Or, I believe I should like that very much. Rarely did she accept in a rush of emotion. She had been taught all her life to guard herself. But beneath that stillness, something enormous often stirred. Afterward, they might walk back to the house side by side, not touching. She might glance up at him once. He might look away. Inside, her mother would already be waiting, with a glance that said, "Is it done?" And then the machinery began. The announcement was the first public declaration. Sometimes a short notice was placed in the newspaper. A match has been arranged between Miss Eleanor C. Whitmore of Claverton Hall and Mr. Gideon Lark of Durham. Just that. Nothing more. But it would be read, folded, whispered about. Neighbors would call. Letters would arrive. Dresses would be discussed. Gifts would be prepared. In middle-class households, a small gathering might be hosted, tea and cake in the drawing room, where guests would offer their congratulations in tones of quiet envy. The couple would stand near one another, but not too near. Their eyes would carry what their words could not. "I am pleased for you both," the guests would say. "You make a handsome pair." Engagement meant more than affection. It meant responsibility. The gentleman was now expected to begin preparing a household. If he was already of independent means, he might begin designing a home, selecting furniture, commissioning a carriage. If he were still dependent on inheritance or career advancement, the engagement might stretch into months, even years. There were cases of couples remaining engaged for 4, 5, 6 years, waiting for fortune to align with feeling. The woman, meanwhile, entered a different kind of transformation. She was no longer simply a daughter. She was now a bride-to-be. Her letters took on a new signature. She received visits more than before. Her wardrobe was expanded, more white, more lace. She might begin a hope chest. She might receive her first set of monogrammed linens. And she was permitted, now, a few small liberties. She might walk with her fiancé in the garden without a chaperone, provided the path remained visible from the house. She might exchange gifts with him: a handkerchief, a book of poetry, a lock of hair carefully wrapped in ribbon. He might send her pressed violets or a locket. He might write to her more freely now, no longer as Miss, but as my dearest. And sometimes, only sometimes, she would write back using his first name. They might sit beside one another at dinner. He might help her into a carriage. Once or twice, they might even be seen smiling. But still, no touch, no kiss, no closed doors. And always the families hovered. For engagement was not final until marriage. And even then it could be undone. If a man was discovered to have debts, or if a woman's conduct was questioned, if gossip swirled too darkly, or fortune failed, the engagement could be quietly withdrawn. No one would speak of it directly, but invitations would stop arriving. Visits would slow, and the couple would drift apart as though it had never happened. For those who remained engaged, however, the months that followed were a strange mixture of closeness and distance. They belonged to one another and yet did not. They were promised and yet untouched. Every word carried weight. Every visit ended in restraint. Every heartbeat waited. And yet, they were allowed to imagine. They might speak carefully of the life they would share, of the rooms they would furnish, the garden she would tend, the library he would build. They might daydream, in carefully measured language, about how she would sing in the evenings, how he would read to her. They might even speak in vague terms of children. "If we are blessed," he might say, "when the time is right." It was a kind of romance that required patience, and faith, and restraint so profound it sometimes ached. But within that ache was something beautiful, the quiet knowledge that love, once veiled and chaperoned and reduced to letters, was at last permitted to breathe. Not fully, not yet, but soon. And so they waited, as they always had. Only now they waited together. It always began quietly, with numbers whispered behind closed doors, long before the girl even knew her name was being traded like property. In drawing rooms shaded by heavy velvet curtains, over decanters of brandy and ledgers bound in calfskin, fathers spoke plainly. "If the Hargrave girl brings 10,000, I'll consider it," one might say, eyes never rising. "But not a shilling less. She's pleasant, but not exceptional. and the family's name is only 2 generations deep. There was no mention of the girl's laughter, or the poems she secretly wrote by candlelight, or the fact that she once wept while reading a sonnet alone in the garden. Those things had no place here, because in Victorian England, affection had value, but it did not have worth. That belonged to the dowry. A girl might be clever, kind, beautiful even, but if her father could not promise a proper sum, she was classified with a single, brutal word, unmarriageable. She would never hear it directly, of course. It would echo instead in quiet refusals, in calling cards that went unanswered, in parlor chairs that sat undisturbed. Suitors would vanish like mist. A mother might stop speaking at breakfast. The house would grow quiet, and no one would say why. And the girl would know. She always knew. For those who had it, the fortune, the promise, the dowry tied in neat lines across parchment, doors opened that others could only watch from outside. A young man, perhaps from a dwindling estate, might consider marrying the daughter of a soap magnate. Her hands might be coarse, her accent provincial, but if the papers said 20,000, he could learn to love her, or at least tolerate her. The negotiations were delicate, not unlike chess. The girl's father would insist on a marriage settlement, not a casual gift, but a binding legal contract, often drawn by solicitors, often argued over late into the night. How much would be paid upon engagement? Upon marriage? Upon the birth of a first son? And what if the husband died? Would the money revert to the bride, or be held in trust? Every possibility was weighed. Every future misfortune predicted. And the girl? She would be seated upstairs during it all, pretending to read, pretending not to listen through the floorboards. Sometimes she would cry. Sometimes she would simply stare. And sometimes she would feel nothing at all. Not all girls were so passive. Some, especially the ones who knew how the world worked, began to treat themselves as commodities early on. They studied their prospects like a merchant studies his stock. They learned the value of silence, the weight of modesty, the way to charm without seeming to. And they played the game better than the men. Others rebelled, quietly or wildly. There were women who refused to marry at all, who watched the parade of eligible men come and go and folded their arms in cold defiance. "I would rather starve with dignity," one famously wrote, "than feast with a man I cannot abide." These were not always heroines. Some were punished for it, left behind, called difficult. But some endured. Some even thrived as writers, reformers, salon hosts, or secret lovers. And then there were those caught in between. A girl with half a dowry, enough to attract attention, not enough to seal a match. She might be courted intensely for a season, only to be dropped when her father's finances were quietly revealed. Worse, she might be led into affection by a suitor who knew her position, then abandoned her under pressure from his own family. "She's charming," his mother would whisper, "but she brings nothing to the table." And love, warm, trembling love, would be pushed aside by reality. Some marriages were more ruthless still. There were men, often older, often powerful, who married girls solely for their dowries. These women would arrive in grand homes with marble staircases and servants who never smiled. They would dine at long tables, alone at one end. Their husbands would be absent, cold, sometimes cruel. And at night, they would lie awake in canopied beds, surrounded by silk, wondering what price had been paid for their comfort, and by whom. There were stories, whispered behind fans, of girls who tried to flee these arrangements. A girl who disappeared the night before her wedding. A girl who refused to sign the settlement. A girl who swallowed laudanum rather than marry the banker from Bristol. These tales were rare, but they spread like fire through drawing rooms, warnings and legends both. And yet there were victories. There were matches of true love against the odds, where affection triumphed over calculation. A man of modest income who married a vicar's daughter because she made him laugh in church. A young woman with no dowry who won the heart of a baronet simply by the way she looked at him while handing him tea. They were whispered about, too, though often with skepticism. It won't last, people would murmur. But sometimes it did. Those were the stories that kept others dreaming. That perhaps, somewhere beneath all the parchment and ink and figures, something softer could survive. That even in a world ruled by ledgers, the heart might still have a voice, however faint. But for most, the path was clear. Love was not free. It was bargained, signed, and settled. And long after the wedding bells had faded, the price still lingered, in the silver candlesticks, in the linens monogrammed with another man's name, in the quiet sigh of a woman looking out a window she did not choose, wearing a ring she did not desire. She may have been spoken for, but she was never asked. It was not always proper. It was not always sanctioned, but it was always human. In a world built upon decorum and control, where gloved hands never touched and gazes turned quickly away, passion did not disappear. It only learned to whisper, to hide, to fold itself behind doors that locked with soft clicks, to linger in letters that were never signed, to live in silences so deep they echoed louder than confession. These were the loves that could not be named, the ones born in stillness, in passing glances, in accidental nearness, in the unbearable ache of possibility. A lady's maid brushing her mistress's hair, pausing just slightly too long. A stable boy helping a daughter of the house into a carriage, their fingers meeting in that brief, impossible space. A tutor who should know better. A widow who should not feel again. And yet they did. They all did. Some loves were gentle, born of kindness, of hours spent in conversation that no one else noticed. Others burned, fierce and reckless, like matches struck in cellars. They knew the risk. That was part of the thrill. For if the drawing room was built on rules, the world beyond it, the corridors, the libraries, the gardens in moonlight, was made for breaking them. It began in tiny ways. A letter left beneath a flower pot. A book with a marked page. A compliment phrased just oddly enough to mean more than it said. "You looked well yesterday," he might say. And she would pause, heart stuttering, not daring to ask what he meant. These secret loves were not always between equals. Often they weren't. There were married men, cold, distant, possessive, who claimed affection they did not earn. And the women who, bound to them by paper and reputation, found comfort elsewhere. With a friend, with a servant, with a man who saw them not as property, but as person. There were governesses, unmarried and vulnerable, who were seduced by the very sons they were paid to discipline. Some resisted. Some fell. Some were cast out, dismissed quietly in the early hours of morning, their trunks already packed by the time they were called down. There were men, refined, respectable, who shared affections not with the women they were expected to pursue, but with one another. Behind closed study doors, over chessboards and brandy, they might touch hands for a moment too long. Never spoken, never acknowledged, but understood. And there were women, brilliant, stifled, who loved other women. Sometimes sisters in friendship, sometimes something deeper. They shared letters full of longing masked as poetry. They lingered in each other's bedrooms long past dusk. And when they married men, They looked at their husbands with eyes that were already elsewhere. Society pretended not to see, or rather, it chose when to see. A scandal, if exposed, could destroy everything. A single letter discovered, a servant who spoke too freely, a missed appointment too often repeated, and the rumors began. The tone of invitations changed. The parlor doors stayed closed. In extreme cases, a woman could be sent away to visit relatives in the country. She would return changed, or not at all. There were stories of elopements, wild, romantic, desperate. A young couple fleeing to Gretna Green under cover of darkness. A woman tossing her reputation into the wind and vanishing with a man who had nothing but a dream and a borrowed horse. Some of these stories ended in ruin, others in small houses by the sea where no one asked too many questions. And there were children, the inevitable consequence of desire unguarded. Some were born in secret and raised as nieces. Others were sent away, their mothers told never to speak of them again. The shame did not pass. It merely shifted like fog. But not all secret loves ended in tragedy. Some survived in silence. A married woman who met her former lover once a year at a garden party. A man who carried a pressed flower in his wallet for 40 years. A housemaid who buried her feelings so deeply they became part of her breath. These were not tales for novels. They were too quiet, too ordinary, too real. And yet, sometimes, truth slipped out. In an old diary, in the margins of a prayer book, in a final letter found after death, where a name no one recognized was written again and again in fading ink. And then, suddenly, the past rewrote itself. A spinster aunt remembered not as cold, but as heartbroken. A grandfather's melancholy explained. Because in a world where passion was forbidden, it did not die. It went underground. It survived in coded glances, in misdirected poems, in memories folded like handkerchiefs and hidden in drawers. It endured in the quietest parts of people, the places they never spoke of, the places that throbbed long after everything else had gone still. And though society could punish it, exile it, erase it, bury it under shame, it could never quite kill it. Because the heart is stubborn. Even in silence, it remembers. Not all stories ended in marriage. Some women, in the long silence after the proposals stopped or never came, found themselves not at the center of society, but drifting along its edges. They became the ones you passed in corridors, seated by the window with their embroidery, or tending to a garden no one else cared about. They were not loud. They were not scandalous. They were simply unmatched. The Victorians had names for them. Spinster, maid, unclaimed, sometimes unfortunate. The words were soft in sound but sharp in judgment. They did not just describe a woman's status, they defined her worth. A woman unmarried by 30 was no longer simply a daughter or sister. She became a fixture, a companion, a figure of quiet caution. She never married, people would say, with just enough pause to imply pity. Sometimes the decision was hers. There were women who refused, who watched men arrive with their stiff collars and polished boots, offering nothing but control, and said no. Who would rather read in solitude than dine beside someone they could not respect. Who refused to hand over their minds, their finances, their freedom. These women were rare. They were often punished for it, with whispers, with social exclusions, with rooms at the end of the hall. But they held their heads up. They made their own tea. They wrote in journals that no one was allowed to read. And then there were the widows. They came in all forms, young and still blushing from their first season, or lined and tired after decades of service to a husband they might not have even liked. Some wore their mourning-like armor, all black, veils thick, expressions unreadable. Others softened with time, dressing in grays and mauves, their loss fading into memory like smoke on glass. But grief was never quite predictable. Some widows mourned deeply. They kept his books, his pipe, his chair untouched. They visited his grave weekly. They referred to him always as my late husband, even decades after his death. Others felt relief, quiet, shameful relief, the sigh that came after years of obligation. They mourned the idea of love, perhaps, but not the man. There were those who had never married at all, not by choice, but by circumstance. Perhaps the man they loved died in war, or went bankrupt, or married someone else. Perhaps he never asked, or perhaps he asked too late. These women lived in a kind of limbo. They were not widows, yet they carried absence like a widow does, an ache with no grave to visit. They filled their lives with small duties. They helped raise nieces and nephews. They managed charitable projects. They taught piano. They hosted quiet teas where the conversation was gentle and the laughter subdued. They became the ones everyone relied on, and yet no one waited for. Their birthdays passed softly. Their names appeared on the margins of family trees. They were always Aunt Margaret, Miss Eleanor, Cousin Jane, never wife, never mother. And yet these women were not empty. Some loved deeply, once or quietly or always. They carried that love like an amulet beneath their clothing. A memory of a man who once touched their hand and then disappeared. A letter never sent. A moment in the garden that no one else saw. Their hearts were not hollow, only hidden. Some lived richly. They traveled. They studied Greek. They took long walks and spoke their minds freely because there was no one to tell them not to. They were unmarried, yes, but not unloved. Some built lives so full they looked at married women with something between pity and relief. Others were simply tired of being the extra chair, the plus one, the woman who must excuse herself when conversation turns to husbands, to children, to homes built by two. These women did not weep. They just withdrew. They walked slowly. They spoke only when spoken to. But if you looked closely enough, you might still see the girl she once was flickering beneath her expression. And the world, for all its obsession with courtship, rarely asked what happened to these women. They were background, wallpaper, until one day they weren't, until they died quietly in the rooms they had always lived in, their possessions sorted by nieces who barely knew them. And sometimes, among the handkerchiefs and the teacups, someone would find a photo, a letter, a pressed flower, and suddenly, the life no one noticed became a mystery that could never be solved. Because even the unmatched had stories. They just weren't told. But they were there, in the way she touched the lace curtain each morning, in the unopened drawer, in the way she paused when someone said his name, in the silence after dinner, when the fire burned low and her hands rested in her lap, and her eyes, just for a moment, were far away. She was never anyone's wife, but she was not no one. She had lived. The curtains were always drawn, not because there was something to hide, but because there was always something at risk. In Victorian households, with their lace-covered lamps and polished doorknobs, every inch of space was curated for appearances. Even feelings had to pass through embroidery and etiquette before they could show their face. And yet, behind those carefully tied-back drapes, behind those spotless hallways and portraits of dead ancestors, something restless stirred. Desire. Not the polite, marriage-bound variety. Not the acceptable blush over tea or the respectful exchange of glances in a parlor. No, this was the other kind. The kind that didn't ask permission. The kind that didn't wear gloves. The kind that didn't care if the door was open, only if someone was listening. And someone always was. In the libraries, in the drawing rooms, in the servants' quarters, beneath the surface of rigid civility, people were burning. Not all of them, not loudly, but deeply. And their desire, raw, complicated, forbidden, rarely followed the rules of class, gender, or family. Sometimes it was the governess. She lived under the same roof. She watched the master of the house more closely than the mistress did. She knew how he took his tea. She knew when his voice changed. And maybe one day, their fingers brushed as she handed him a book. And something passed between them. Not love, not lust. Just permission, for a moment, to imagine. Sometimes it was the maid. Too young, too poor, too plain for anyone to notice, except the youngest son, who caught her humming in the hallway, who watched her bare hands wash the family's linen, who began leaving notes beneath her broom. And one night, when everyone was asleep, he followed her down the kitchen stairs. And they didn't speak. And they didn't stop. And in the morning, she was gone. Sometimes it was the women themselves. A bride who lay beside a man who never touched her and began to crave not passion, but attention from someone else's husband, or from her sister's friend, or from her own housemaid. And it started slowly. A compliment held too long. A back turned slowly during a fitting. A kiss not imagined, but remembered afterward as if it had happened. Sometimes it was two men, caught between expectation and instinct. Their friendship stretched too thin. A touch on the shoulder during a card game. A shared brandy, taken after everyone had gone to bed. A moment in the garden when one said, "Don't go in just yet," and the other didn't. None of this could be spoken, because desire was dangerous. Not just socially, but legally. A woman accused of impropriety could be locked away in an asylum. A servant caught with a master could be dismissed without references. A man who loved another man could be imprisoned, his life dismantled in public disgrace. So everything had to be coded. A gaze, a sentence at dinner, a pause on the stairs, a letter folded twice instead of 3 times, a pressed flower with no explanation, an excuse to stay in the room when everyone else had left. And when it happened, if it happened, it was never loud. It was a door that didn't shut all the way, a room with the fire too high, a hand not pulled away fast enough, a breath that caught, a name whispered and then swallowed. And then came the silence, because no one could know, because everyone suspected, because the walls in Victorian homes were thin and the servants gossiped, and mothers watched too closely, and brothers said things they weren't supposed to understand. So those who dared paid. Some were discovered. A letter opened. A witness awakened. A scarf left in the wrong room. A servant who talked for coins. And when the truth emerged, it didn't explode, it unraveled. Quietly, painfully. A wedding canceled. A reputation erased. A name struck from an invitation list and never spoken again. Others vanished. Sent to the country. Sent abroad. Sent away. Some married, because that was the only way to bury the memory. They took husbands. They bore children. They cooked and smiled and prayed. And at night, they closed their eyes and remembered the one they couldn't have. And some never stopped. There were lovers who met once a year, under a festival banner, among crowds too large to notice. There were friends who touched knees beneath the sewing table. There were housekeepers who saved locks of hair. There were men who visited the same opera seat every Friday, not for the music, but for the man in the third box on the right. These were not stories in history books. These were moments kept alive in diaries no one read, in jewelry boxes no one opened, in the pause before a name, in a letter burned but not forgotten, in the smell of someone's coat long after they left. Because desire, real desire, cannot be killed. It can be hidden. It can be punished. But it doesn't die. It waits. Behind curtains. Behind silence. Behind everything that is proper. Waiting for one glance. One breath. One yes. Marriage was not the end. It was the threshold. They told young girls that marriage was the reward. That if they stitched their smiles just right, and kept their words small and clean, and dressed in the appropriate shades of modesty, they would be chosen. And once chosen, the curtain would rise, and the play of life would begin in earnest. But no one told them that the curtain, once lifted, never came down again. After all the parlor visits, the exchanged letters, the chaperoned walks, the bouquets dried in books, and the glances stolen across tea sets, after all the sighing, the hoping, the waiting, came the wedding. It was beautiful, of course. She wore white, or cream, or lavender gray if she was older, her sleeves buttoned high to the throat, her gloves pale as breath. He wore a frock coat, or a uniform if he had one. There were flowers, there was music, there were eyes watching everything. And somewhere near the altar, behind the vicar's soft words and the rustle of silk, a woman would quietly realize she had no idea what came next. Because no one spoke of marriage. Not truly. They spoke of weddings, not of mornings after. They taught girls how to embroider handkerchiefs, not how to undress before a stranger. They praised modesty and then expected passion. They condemned knowledge, then demanded performance. So when the door shut on the wedding night and the husband looked at her, not as a guest, but as his, many women felt something colder than fear. They felt ownership. And many men, told since boyhood that a wife was a reward, reached for her like a prize they'd earned, not a person. It wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it was tender. Sometimes clumsy. Sometimes two people laughed through the awkwardness and learned each other's hands slowly. But even in the best of marriages, something shifted. The illusion was gone. The ideal became flesh, and flesh, real, trembling, complicated, did not always behave as dreams do. He had expectations. She had no words for what she wanted or feared. And in the days that followed, the girl became a wife. Not just in name, but in structure. She was expected to leave her family, her room, her books, her routine. She entered a new house with new rhythms, new servants, new expectations. She managed meals. She soothed egos. She planned guest lists. She bled in silence, learned to smile at in-laws, memorized the creak of unfamiliar stairs. Her letters changed tone. They were still polite, but shorter, less poetry, more practicality. We are settled now. He is kind. The evenings are long. Sometimes she would write something else. I am tired. Or, the garden is very quiet here. He changed too. The suitor who once wrote poems now rose early for estate business. He spoke of markets, tenants, grain prices. He no longer noticed how her hair was pinned or how her voice wavered when speaking of home. Sometimes he was still kind, but something soft had gone. In some homes, the kindness vanished altogether. There were husbands who demanded obedience more than affection, who reminded her, subtly or not, that she was bought, not chosen. There were women who grew silent from bruises no one asked about. who learned to speak only in front of others, who carried the weight of duty on backs too slender for it. And yet, there were others. There were women who grew stronger in marriage, who learned, within its walls, how to negotiate, how to wield influence, who raised children with fierce love, who carved out freedom within structure, who made the house not a prison, but a throne. But even then, even in good marriages, there was loss. The loss of girlhood, of the self that existed before Mrs. was carved into her name. Some mourned it quietly. Some never noticed until years later, when they found an old ribbon or poem and couldn't recognize the hand that wrote it. Some never had children, and were whispered about. Some had too many, and disappeared into motherhood. Some grew bored, some grew bold, and some grew distant. Not from cruelty, but from realization that marriage was not the ending they were promised. It was just another form of silence. They learned how to perform affection in public and cry in private, how to plan supper for 12 while never being truly asked how they felt, how to keep a house spotless while their mind drifted elsewhere, back to a letter they never sent or a name they never dared speak again. There were men who tried to love them and failed. There were women who stopped trying to be lovable. There were whole marriages built on nothing but the memory of courtship. And yet they stayed. Because leaving was worse. Because there was nowhere to go. Because they loved the children. Because they had nowhere else to be. And some, miraculously, found love after marriage. It bloomed slowly, after arguments, after illness, after loss. It grew from shared grief, from survival, from seeing each other stripped of pretense and choosing to stay. Those were the lucky ones, the rare ones, but most simply endured. They poured tea, they ordered fabric, they hosted guests, and in their eyes, when the candlelight flickered just so, you could still see the girl inside, waiting for someone to ask her if she was happy, and knowing the question would never come.